Morning, everybody. How are we doing today? It's Thursday morning here in the upper Midwest. Today's going to be kind of a short, quick episode. Just wanted to share a couple things that I've been listening to lately. To start off with Jimmy Smith. Boy, sometimes when you get away from him for a little bit and you come back, you just forget how dynamic and intricate and nuanced a player he was. And how you could argue no one ever reinvented an instrument quite like Jimmy Smith reinvented the organ. I mean, obviously Parker, Armstrong, Hawkins, there's a lot of guys that came along and changed the vocabulary of an instrument. And no genre does that probably more often than jazz. I mean, that's one of the great things about jazz to me is how they took their captors' instruments, European classical symphony compositional instruments, horns and reeds that were meant to read what was on paper and express a somber tonality and kind of a rigid platform of what was composed. And they were all meant to be part of a larger orchestral setting. And it was a section of trumpets or a section of bones that would create chordal tonalities. And it was the French horns and the clarinets and the violins and the rhythm sections that together created a piece. And these African descendants of slaves, given the opportunity when they found these instruments in their school settings and town villages, took those instruments and just reinvented every one of them. It's one of the great statements of overcoming tyranny and with resistance through the joy of art. I mean, it's hard to really find something more dynamic in its determinism than taking your captors' instruments and showing them, oh, yo, motherfucker, this is how we play this shit. This is how this should have been done. And it's funny because in the jazz idiom, you can really look at almost every instrument you can imagine, from harps to French horns to violins to accordions to harmonicas. I mean, it's just across the board. If there's an instrument out there, these incredibly resilient people, often without training or the ability to read notes or paper, often refuse that privilege in society. And to me, it's one of the great testaments of how a people under tyranny respond. And perhaps this incoming wave of tyranny politically here in the West will result in some great art. I mean, the overtones this orange motherfucker's making towards my country, Canada, Greenland, Panama, the expansionism of wanting to be Putin, wanting to be a dictator, wanting to be seen as a great emperor. But history's pages won't see him that way. He's living in an antiquated world. And the sad truth is Putin will be seen in higher regard 100 years from now than the Cheeto. But I only bring that up to reference that under tyranny, great songs of resistance and a resilience is born and bred. And maybe that's the one silver lining to all of this, is that out of this maybe our arts will be reborn. And God knows they've become a stagnant, pale, undrinkable pond for a while. From Kanye West to, the entire pool of pop music is, for the most part, a very tepid water that's not worth consumption, and it certainly isn't going to edify one's being. Going back to the days of Bob Dylan, who's seeing a bit of a resurgence right now with the film about him, I suddenly see people at karaoke's singing Bob Dylan who probably haven't heard Bob Dylan in 30 years. Poorly, I might add. And there's always a bit of irony in singing Bob Dylan poorly. Because it's not that hard to sing like Bob Dylan. Oh my God, you just gotta, how does it feel? I mean, you just gotta kind of embody a little bit of that. And have his cadence down. That rhythmic kind of lack of rhythm almost. I mean, God, I've heard some Dylan songs butchered as of late. And one of the great other parts of this equation was urban blacks had the exposure to pianos, French horns, upright basses, drum sets. That was the privilege of living in an urban setting and being the underclass in the city. Sweeping chimneys and being kitchen staff and not picking cotton in the fields. If you were rural, you didn't have access to those same instruments. And that's where a lot of the instruments of the blues genre comes into the fore. I mean, the guitar was something that you would find in the country. The banjo, the diddley bow, the washboard, the spoon, some of the things that you see in that rural country pastiche was a bit like soul food. It was out of necessity. We didn't come here for ham hocks and oxtails and pig's feet, but that's what was left to us. Washboards, soap buckets. I mean, we're going to take the soap bucket, flip it upside down, put a string on, and I'm going to pluck that motherfucker, and we're going to make some good times. I mean, it's just incredible resilience in that. It should amaze you how the rural black turned household utensils into a musical art form that changed the world. Changed jazz, ragtime, pop. I mean, the blues is so alive in so many things. And it's funny how often I'll be listening to a pop song from any decade and just hear the blues just riffing through it. Someone was singing Black Velvet the other night, Alana Miles, which is a great song. It's a straight blues. I listened to a Shania Twain song the other day, just a straight blues. I mean, it's just amazing how omnipresent the blues is. But I digress. So we're getting back to Jimmy Smith now. Smith locked himself in a warehouse with a B3 organ. I think it was for a year plus. And spent 12, 16 hours a day out there sometimes. Just riffing. Just Charlie Parkering the organ. And yes, Parker is a verb. You can use it as a descriptive word to describe reinventing an instrument. And Parker's innovations were undoubtedly wide sweeping across all genres. And what Smith does on the organ, I'm listening here to Club Baby Grand, Wilmington, Delaware, from 56, number 1529, early Blue Note LP. I think this is a part 2, actually. Of course, I have the other one as well. But and the lovely, incredibly talented Thornell Schwartz is his guitar player at this time. And I want to highlight something here. Thornell is articulate, elaborate, expressive, emotive, delicate, frivolous. He bounces around with a light and elastic sound. A sound that an organ should not be able to replicate in any way. Get out of here, Jimmy. Go sit down, Jimmy. What are you doing? I mean, it's really incredible. The dexterity and nimbleness and singularity of tone that he achieved on an instrument that was usually reserved for recording, setting under melody, under chordal brut for other soloists, the backing for a church setting to set chord, and the nimble dexterity of what Jimmy Smith innovates. And there was players before him, of course, notably Count Basie and Wild Bill Davis, and I mean there was quite a few guys that did dabble in the organ pre Jimmy Smith. But Jimmy Smith's arrival in 55, 56, it leads to just this explosion of the organ as the new saxophone. And the proliferation of organ players in jazz in the late 50s, early 60s, it sweeps across, especially the black jazz labels. Not so much the white, cool jazz. I mean, you don't really see a lot of great white jazz organ players from this era. It was very much a black church, black blues, black soul swing. And a lot of what became soul jazz was rooted in the organ guitar gospelization that countered the intricacy and ferocity and lack of melody that was being rooted in the avant-garde and free jazz and even in bebop. And so Jimmy Smith led to all these imitators coming along, many of whom were fantastic in their own right. To make no mistake about it, Don Patterson was fabulous. Jack McDuff was fabulous. I mean, a lot of great players. Shirley Scott, bad bitch. I mean, that girl stayed in a man's industry for 30 years. You got to be a bad girl to live in a man's world that long. I mean, you just do. But, I mean, Smith just really deserves another tip of the hat. And it's funny how when I come back to him after being removed for a few months, his virtuosity impresses on every scale. And I shudder at the people who disdain and speak down upon organ jazz. I mean, you're wearing clown shoes in a dance club, and you can't get on the dance floor wearing clown shoes. Go sit down. This guy was every bit the virtuoso of any player on any horn. Thornell Schwartz, by the way, had a great record as a leader on Argo. That's worth seeking out. It's a really fantastic session. I mean, I literally was blown away by listening to this again yesterday. It just really deserves worth being said again. How great a player Jimmy Smith is, and how this is not just some cool assemblage of off-the-hand, unsoulful. It lacks nothing. It has all the merit and meat and intensity and vibration and spirituality of all the pompous jazz listeners out there in the world think that an Alice Coltrane has. In fact, I feel Jimmy Smith's blues and Jimmy Smith's soul 1,000 times more than I do the intellectualism of Alice Coltrane. And Alice Coltrane's fine when you got some incense burning and you want to have a kind of a pretentious assemblage of intellectuals. I mean, it's that's who it really appeals to. That's who its listening base is. And few outside of that circle dive into it. And they're the same ones who want to disparage the organ jazz, always, because they get it. That sophisticated stuff's so much more mature and so much more garbage. The blues is the most spiritual music in the world. The simplicity of melody and expressing over the blues is the most honest and integral form of expression a musician can have. Composition is rigid. When you get locked into something too composed, it lacks the ability to go wherever the fuck the spirit leads you. And yet so many people think that the most complex stuff has the most meaning. What a misdirection that is. Because it's really, I've said this before, but if you're following a complex set of directions, your ability to let your mind drift and think freely is very limited. But if you're driving a trip home that you've done 1,000 times, you can do it blindfolded. Your mind can wander all kinds of places and express whatever it's feeling within that moment. The rigidity of composition is fettering. it's a prison. Oh, where's that next change? Where's that next key change? Where's that next time signature? Oh shit! What number are we on? I mean, is he on the 3 or the 4? I lost my way. And people who played with Monk and Cornet and many of the other free jazz often reference. I mean, even guys playing with Coltrane, McCoy and Elvin would say it got so frenetic. It was difficult to know and define the blues and the feel at times, and even remember where your pocket was, which is I can say the word anti-ethical of all what jazz and blues kind of set up as the standard foundational base. And so the good news is, a few people out there who want to have Patile down and the fancy avant-garde rare records that didn't sell because they give you this high esteem, go pay your $500 for that rare record and you can put your monocle in and be sophisticated. Good for you. The good news is you can find Jimmy Smith, the gospel of the blues, with tons more soul in it than all that shit combined, in 5 measures of playing. And you can find that for $25. Jimmy Smith's playing, I mean, he sold a lot of records, they're out there. You can find Jimmy Smith's old Blue Notes for good pricing and have more fun than a room full of monocle wearers. Once again, I'm gonna comment. I just get so annoyed by the Facebook posters who see a record that someone posts and they go, "Yeah, I have that. I like it." Ugh. That's not informative. I have that. I like it, and usually it's followed by, "I have this pressing," and sometimes even worse, it's followed by, "I have this pressing and this pressing and this pressing." The body of jazz is so fucking huge. Why would you have 3, 4, 5 pressings on the same fucking record? Do you have the rest of the jazz canon? I'm guessing you don't. But you've kept your scope so narrow, and what you defined as what's important to you so within a certain lane, to not have to accept how little you know about the rest of the jazz universe. And we all do that in politics and religion and, I mean, all fat walks of life. We close ourselves off to things we don't want to have to take the time to learn about. And then just overindulge in those few things that we do know about. And it's kind of ridiculous. It's kind of ridiculous. Another Blue Note I listened to the other day, moving on. Really, really enjoyed it. And this is giving leadership here to Jutta Hip, the great German piano player who was friends with Alfred and Frank going back to their days in Berlin. But I'm not going to be dishonest here. The star of this session is Zoot Sims. And Zoot wasn't a Blue Note recording artist, so he doesn't get the leadership here. But it's his playing that really shines on this. And you have another couple of players on here that aren't really Blue Note artists. You have Jerry Lloyd on the trumpet, who I can't tell you nothing about, if I'm honest. You have Ahmed Abdul Malik on the bass, who dove into a lot of interesting instruments later in his career. And he shows up a lot at Riverside in the late 50s, early 60s. So having him here at Blue Note on this session on the bass is a bit of a different place for him to be. And then you have young Ed Thigpen on the drums, who was probably on the heels of having played with Oscar Peterson and Ray Brown at this point. I mean, he was part of that great trio for a number of years, and they recorded a lot of great stuff together, that trio. That's one of the great trios in jazz. Peterson, Ray Brown, and Thigpen, man. And Thigpen, if I remember, replaced Barney Kessel. So they went from having a guitar-based piano trio to a piano, bass, and drum trio, which is a weird kind of switching of personnel there. But, I mean, just a fantastic player, Thigpen. And his one record as a leader at Verve is really a good session. And if I remember, Thigpen went to Denmark and spent the rest of his years out there. But this record really is beautiful, cool cover. Is that an early Reed Miles? It's about the time Reed Miles showed up here. It is, yeah, it's early Reed Miles. And I mean, that kind of sets the table for much of the graphic art that was to come in the rest of the late 50s. And it kind of runs opposite of what David L. Martin was doing at Clef. And obviously, there's some influence here from, oh my God, the great Burt Goldblatt. Goldblatt's influence on Reed Miles is pretty unmistakable. But obviously, Reed Miles takes it to another level. The modernity, the clean color graphics, the lines, a lot of what Reed Miles innovates is still timeless to this day, which is an impressive feat in and of itself. Because very little in graphic design stays static. We're going to dive into next the magnificent Thad Jones. And these records are all kind of concurrent in the Blue Note canon, 1527, 1529, 1530. So they're all early 56 probably. Thad, one of the great Jones brothers of Detroit. His brother Alvin was a drummer with Coltrane. Hank Jones, one of the great piano players who led a lot of the sessions at Savoy, along with Kenny Clark and Wendell Marshall. Hank Jones was also a member of the great rhythm section out of New York with that fantastic group of musicians. But Thad was a great player. Played with Count Basie for a number of years. A very lyrical, blues-rooted player. Sweet tone, melodic center. He loved to express a story. He had a really vivacious, up-tempo tone. He could really, slash about when he wanted. Beautiful clarity. He wasn't your Clifford Brown, Freddie Hubbard, but he was, a forebear to the guys like Donald Byrd, and even to Lee Morgan on some level. A really beautiful lyrical player who loves to tell you a story. And I find his 3 Blue Notes to be 3 of the treasures of that era of Blue Note. And that's right before Blue Note really finds what Blue Note becomes. It's around 1529, 1535, where they really step into what their lane's going to become. And they make 200 records consecutively of some of the greatest hard bop ever assembled. And this is a bit of a forebear to that. It's still got a little bit of the old post-bop, small group, jazz, swing era guys playing in small group settings with some elements of hard bop and bebop sprinkled in. But Thad Jones wasn't rooted in the bebop setting like a Fats Navarro was. That wasn't really his lane like a Dizzy Gillespie. He was a bit more rooted in the Sweets Edison camp, coming from a bit of an older school mentality. Another player we listened to last week, Django Reinhardt. Django died in 42, I believe it was. So none of his sessions are going to be actual LP recordings. They're going to be largely culled from 78s and EPs and other settings. He did a couple sessions for the Leonard Feather label period that are really worth seeking out. And there's a session he does for Clef for Norman Granz in like 52, right around his passing. Is that right, 52? I think it is, 52. He passed the 52, sorry. And he comes to America, and he's just really starting to take off. And it's his work at the Hot Club in Paris with the great violinist, Stefan Grappelli, who has some great records as a leader as well. But Grappelli is really a revelation on the violin. And those two really set the table for a lot of the sounds that were to come. And in some ways, the cafe gypsy style of jazz, which people probably don't like that moniker anymore, but it's what it was labeled at the time, gypsy jazz. It's a baguette in your mouth. It's a cafe on the River Seine, sitting there on a little wired chair, enjoying an espresso and the morning sunrise over the city. And it's really kind of timeless stuff in a way. And Django was an intricate, beautiful player who, his stuff is really worth seeking out. And it doesn't have the same label affiliation as some of the later guys from the great jazz era of the 50s and 60s because his passing was so early. But you do see a lot of compilations on even the bigger labels of Django's body of work that he was such an icon that the bigger labels would seek out his titles and recessions from smaller labels and reissue them on double LPs like this one. So this is a 2 LP set. I think these recordings are from the late 30s, 36, 37. The Quintet of the Hot Club of France. And, I mean, enough said. It's just fantastic stuff. A couple of things I want to jump into real quick here. A great Jack Teagarden record. And Teagarden, New Orleans bone player from the swing Dixie sound, who really evolved into a much broader post-Dixie, post-bop player. Plays in a lot of small group settings. Worked with Armstrong's All-Stars for a long time. Teagarden's a brilliant lyricist on the bone, and also one of the great singers who borrows some from Armstrong's vocabulary and vernacular, expressive with his voice, both on the bone and with a microphone. And I mean, his version of Autumn Leaves on here, just gorgeous. I found this record incredibly listenable, and being on Capitol, of course, it's I wouldn't say it's easy listening because it's still got a lot of meat to it, but it's very accessible. And I pulled out a few other Capitol things the other day just because I was in that kind of vein. Sinatra's Come Fly With Me, Billy May, orchestra behind him. Come Fly With Me is great, and this record takes you on a journey around the world, which is fun. I mean, you end up in Moonlight, Vermont, the Isle of Capri in Italy, autumn in New York, on the road to Mandalay. I mean, it's just fun stuff. Mandalay was in Burma, if I remember right. April in Paris, Blue Hawaii, Brazil. So you get the theme going on there. And Sinatra's in fine form with his full, boisterous, well-voiced jazz pop singing. It's a great record worth seeking out on Capitol number 920, which probably puts it in late 50s, 57, 58, I'm guessing. His body of work at Capitol is really outstanding. And I like his later Reprise stuff as well, for sure. But his Capitol work is just so boisterous and so full of love and energy and excitement. And of course, he played with the Dorsey brothers at a young age, so he comes up around a lot of the jazz greats. But he recognizes quite early that the black guys were the ones he wanted to record with often. But this is with a white orchestra, Billy May. And the last time I talked to you about Louis Prima. Speaking of Armstrong, another New Orleans legend was the great Louis Prima. And I'm going to show you two of his finest records here. And these are both probably 57, 58 on Capitol. And these are such fun records. And they should never be overlooked or passed over if you have a chance to buy them. The playing on these records is just outstanding. Sam Butera is an incredible saxophone player, just wonderful. I mean, he's cheeky. Keely Smith sings on a number of the numbers with him. And I'm just going to go through some of the titles that most people are going to know some of these titles through filmographies and television shows. I'm just a gigolo, and everywhere I go, David Lee Roth covers those two songs, obviously, which kind of tells you how shticky, in a way, David Lee Roth always was. He was always wanting to be a lounge act, which is where he probably belongs. Nothing's Too Good for My Baby, Body and Soul. Wish I had my reading glasses with me here. Jump, Jive, and Wail. I mean, that was used in an ad campaign a number of years back. Everybody knows Jump, Jive, and Wail. So this is Louis Prima, The Wildest. And then The Wildest, Call the Wildest is the follow-up. Great cover right there. And this has Pennies from Heaven on it. And the version of Autumn in New York in this is just fantastic as well. When You're Smiling in the Chic of Araby, so fun. So fun. I got the Wool on a String. The Pump song is so cheeky. There'll Be No Next Time. Closest to the Bone, The Juicier the Meat. Yeah, that's great stuff, man. Strict New Orleans joy. And Prima, for all his showiness and pop sensibility, was really rooted in a strong New Orleans jazz, swing, Dixie pop fusion that's laced with incredible playing. These are not hard bop records. They're not Blue Note, Lee Morgan. But they're incredibly accessible, fun, commercially viable, Capitol jazz with some of the great... I can't remember who the bone players on those records. Someone will probably put it in the comments. But, man, some of the bone on these records is fantastic. Prima, of course, played the trumpet himself. And the lyricism, the expression, the dynamic flavor, it's all top of the mark stuff. It really is. And Prima really deserves to be elevated in today's canon and seen as one of the great jazz innovators because his lineage goes back so far. And he wrote Sing, 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 one of the greatest swing songs of all time. So Prima's really an icon that is overlooked today by a lot of people, and he deserves a big tip of the hat. He's a fantastic player, and the records are so fun. And Keely Smith, of course, was a great singer, and he had issues with the women in his group. I think he was a bit of a womanizer, and those were different times, of course, and not the most politically correct probably in some ways, but man, just Pennies from Heaven, Jump, Jive, and Wail, I mean, Just a Gigolo, these are fun songs that are kind of eternal in the pop lexicon. And you should find those records and get them. They're not that expensive when you see them because Capitol Records sold well, and they're really worth diving into. So that wraps up today's episode. Y'all have a great day. Find those records. Dig your Django. Dig your Louis Prima. And, of course, Jimmy Smith. Quit looking over him. He's one of the greatest ever without any debate. And those who say different, I don't know what they're listening to. I don't know what their metric of greatness is. Unrivaled virtuosity, channeled through the rivers of soul, blues, and feel and emotion. I mean, he earned the right to speak about himself in the third person. Old Jimmy loves this. Jimmy don't do that. And the Jazz Shepherd does all this. So y'all be safe. Y'all have a great day. We'll talk to y'all soon. Peace.